Okay, so continuing with the concept of German socialism, we're about to get down to the guts of what it is that we wanted to talk about in the first place, with the entire last hour of content that we did being sort of the setup. Otto and Gregor Strasser had both been part of Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek's Uniclub and are going to have an enormous impact on the world through their participation in the Nazi Party. So both brothers served in the First World War and then in the Freikorps that helped crush the Bavarian Soviet. And then they were on opposite sides of the revolutionary uprising against the Weimar Republic known as the Kapp-Putsch. So Otto...
The reactionary uprising, you mean?
What did I say?
You said revolutionary.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely reactionary. The Kapp-Putsch was not revolutionary, it was reactionary. But right. They were both on opposite sides of that uprising. So Otto joined the Social Democrats and helped defeat the Kapp-Putsch in 1920. But he left the SPD when that same year it also crushed a workers' uprising in the Ruhr. Both brothers would later join the Nazi Party. Gregor joined in 1921 and Otto in 1925. And Gregor would play an enormous role in organizing the Nazi Party in the early years, making himself an indispensable member and probably second only to Hitler in gravitas and authority.
It's funny, like we often talk about like how this stuff's all incoherent, but so was the SPD, like helping crush the Kapp-Putsch and the Ruhr uprising that's a good illustration of just how incoherent everything was.
Right. So Gregor Strasser, I think, famously is the pole of attraction for the more radically self-identified socialist elements in the Nazi Party. His German socialism clashed with Hitler's pragmatic sort of opportunism. Strasser was one of the few top Nazis that wasn't mesmerized by Hitler, a trait which more than likely caused Hitler to despise him. So he was the leader of the Northern Gau of the Nazi Party, and that meant he was in direct competition with the KPD and the SPD for one of the most militantly working class areas of the country. So through Strasser's efforts, the party began to build up a strong base of working class Nazis that supported his more radical version of left National Socialism.
Just for the listener, everyone should know that Chris put left in quotes, and he did that with his fingers just now, but you can't see it.
Yeah, you can't see that. Sorry. So in 25, he proposed a new draft of the NSDAP program, which sort of doubled down on the more socialistic elements of the Nazi Party program. And you could definitely see the clear influence of his brother, Otto Strasser, who was a PhD holding economist.
Sorry, I have to make one more comment about the left in quotes.
Yeah.
It is left National Socialism. It's just like how I always talk about being the left wing of capital. Their left and right are not absolute terms. They're relative terms.
Sure.
Yeah. So left National Socialism is correct. It's just that it's still just National Socialism.
For sure.
Right.
So he wanted to emphasize some of the more socialistic elements of the 25 points, which is the Nazi Party program. So the 25 points called for the state to be, quote, charged first with providing the opportunity for a livelihood and way of life for its citizens. And it called for the abolition of unearned incomes and the breaking of rent slavery. So the document goes on to demand the expansion of old age welfare, nationalization of large trusts, sharing the profits of heavy industry, breaking up large landed estates, and the banning of usury. So that's in the Nazi Party program. What Otto and Gregor wanted to do was emphasize these positions, the more anti-capitalist positions, because they were sort of drowned out by Hitler's anti-Bolshevism and anti-Semitism.
Right.
And Otto and Gregor were primarily concerned with winning over the working class. So the new draft suggested a sort of medieval reorganization of society, like we mentioned before, where land and businesses were held in entail, presided over by a national dictatorship. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in more detail later. So Hitler hated the new draft of the party program, and the rest of the party sided with Hitler, and only a small core of supporters remained true to Strasser's notions of German socialism. And Hitler didn't really care about winning over the proletariat. He never had much regard for conventional definitions of socialism anyway, German or otherwise.
Right.
And throughout his career, he would distance himself further and further from any already vague notions of socialism. Like to Hitler, his socialism was self-explained as the idea of subjugating the concerns of the economy to the national interest, with some anemic pronouncements about care for the health of the nation, right?
It's kind of like most Labor Party figures today. It's like, oh yeah, we're a Labor Party, we're socialists, but like, what does that mean? Oh, we want to be take care of everyone in the nation. It's like, what are you talking about? We're not Tories.
Right. So Hitler was courting the industrialists and the military, so he de-emphasized the socialism portion of National Socialism to the point where it was all but just, meaningless. And he would eventually shoot down Gregor Strasser's ideas of creating National Socialist trade unions, and then Otto Strasser would leave the party, and Gregor would end up submitting to Hitler and sort of abandon his vision of German socialism. In a letter published in the Vossische Zeitung in 1931, he is quoted saying, "We recognize private property. We acknowledge our debts and our obligations to pay them. We are against the nationalization of industry. We are against the nationalization of trade. We are against the planned economy in the Soviet sense. We are against inflation. We are for the gold standard, and when we come to power, there will be no violent changes. We are against absolute autarky." So he basically just completely jettisons his entire German socialist program in order to fall in line with Hitler. And so he gets killed for it anyway.
We're against socialism as National Socialists.
Otto would go on to form his own group called the Combat League of Revolutionary National Socialists, or the Black Front, and would relentlessly assail Hitler's betrayal of German socialism and his cozying up to big business in many publications until he was forced to flee Germany during Hitler's accession to power. So, and like I mentioned before, Otto didn't avoid being killed by Hitler anyway. He died in the Night of the Long Knives.
Right.
And that was primarily because of his opposition to Hitler on and off throughout the entirety of his career in the party, and then him going into talks with the German government when they were negotiating to put the Nazis into power. He entertained the idea that he should be vice chancellor for the Nazis rather than Hitler being chancellor. And Hitler was so pissed about this that Gregor leaves the party. Combined with his opposition, his left opposition to Hitler throughout his entire career in the party, Hitler has him killed in the Night of the Long Knives. And Otto goes on to exile in Prague until things start to heat up, and then he leaves and goes to England, and then he leaves and goes to Canada, where he sits in Canada and writes books about Hitler and the Nazis. It's where we get a lot of the more fantastical notions about Hitler's personality.
Oh, wait, yeah, I never really thought about that. I guess Otto just dies of old age. He lives a peaceful, I want to say normal life, whatever.
Well, he goes back to Germany after the war and founds a conservative socialist party in Germany. And
is that the Socialist Reich Party or the Reich?
No, that was like a Strasserist party that was like virulently anti-Semitic and National Socialist. Strasser's party that he founds when he goes back to Germany is called the German Social Union.
I'm going to pull that up and read about it later.
He stayed a left National Socialist until his death in 1974.
Oh, there was even an East German wing of it as well.
Really? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it was founded in 1990.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Is it even the same party? It doesn't matter.
Anyway,
Yeah, right.
we're moving on to Karl Otto Paetel, the nationalist revolutionary and leader of the self-proclaimed National Bolshevist group, the group of social revolutionary nationalists. I don't feel like reading all of these long-ass German names of everything.
That's probably for the best.
So the concept of National Bolshevism was often used to refer to the conservative revolutionaries like Ernst or Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek, who held notions of German socialism and advocated for an alliance with the USSR. But the GSRN was the sole group to refer to itself as having National Bolshevist ideology. As I mentioned, Ernst was credited with the formation of National Bolshevism as an ideology, but he just was a publisher, and he published a journal called Widerstand, which means resistance. And he was an inspiration for Paetel and the GSRN. It's often assumed now, contemporarily, that National Bolshevism is merely a version of Leninism with a hyper-nationalist element added in, making it similar to most Stalinist regimes in the post-war era. But if you look at Paetel and the GSRN, that's not the way it pans out. National Bolshevism is recognizable primarily as a type of German socialism, an anti-capitalist, Volkish nationalism with a few elements of Bolshevik influence.
I mean, I think most people, if they know anything about National Bolshevism, don't know it's a German phenomenon first.
No, they assume it's, it has everything to do with Eduard Limonov and Alexander Dugin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who formed a National Bolshevik Party in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, a little bit later.
So the GSRN emerged when members of Volkish nationalist youth groups, the Jung Nationaler Bund and the Freischer Schill. So that means like the Young National Union. Jung Nationaler Bund translates literally to Young National Union, which I guess there's probably a more elegant translation of that. Like the Union of Nationalist Youth or something, maybe? That's probably better.
It probably just sounds better in German.
And the Freischer Schill being the Volunteer Corps Schill. The Schill Volunteer Corps.
Right.
Anyway, they formed a loose grouping called the Arbeitsring Junge Front, or the Young Front Workers Circle. The Young Working... Anyway... It's a group of young nationalist workers who aimed to promote cooperation between the nationalist movement and the left. Paetel's vision and the vision of his confederates was to be an organization that bridged the radical left with radical nationalism.
Right.
So young front members attempted to work within the NSDAP and the KPD and the SPD, having some success among the nationalist elements of the left parties, but their closeness to the Marxist groups led to failures within the NSDAP, who were like ostensibly closer to their views than the KPD or the SPD.
Yeah, I guess I could see how when you try to be a friend to all, you end up being a friend to none.
Yeah. So, like, for instance, the National Bolsheviks had ideas of expanded German Lebensraum. They advocated for a mystical German paganism. They were pretty culturally anti-Semitic about Jewish capitalism specifically. And they had notions of the special character of the German race. So their increasing estrangement from the nationalist right led to the formation of the GSRN as a distinct political group that existed outside of the SPD and the KPD.
Right.
And they eventually would give up cooperating with the KPD when they realized the KPD was only entertaining their overtures because they were trying to absorb them.
Yeah, that's we kind of talked about that like about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago.
Maybe.
We did a discussion about I don't remember what it was called. I don't know. We talked a little bit about the confusing morass of
right.
What was it called? Doesn't
What,
matter.
the National Bolshevism and German Communism episodes? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we focused primarily on elements within the Communist Party that entertained National Bolshevism. And this is basically focusing on that from the other end.
Right,
yeah.
right.
So there were fundamental irreconcilable difference between the GSRN and the Marxists that put them squarely in opposing camps. National Bolshevism and Strasserism are carelessly used to refer to the same ideology, but in reality, they have divergent positions. There are more similarities between the two than between National Bolshevism and like Marxism or Leninism. There are important differences. So while the Strasser variant of German socialism was placed firmly in the tradition of folkish anti-capitalism and contained a program that is easily recognizable as conservative, corporatist, and romantic, the National Bolsheviks program called for a radical egalitarian and Soviet council system. Both variants of German socialism are similar to the nationalist socialism advocated by Fichte and later folkish writers, but Padel's ideology contained elements of Leninist revolutionism that Strasser's did not.
So I guess the Bolshevism in National Bolshevism is more than just an aesthetic appreciation for the martial virtue of the Bolsheviks, but also kind of inspired by the program of it as well.
Right. So both the Strasserists and National Bolshevists attempted to emphasize their differences with the Marxists. The most obvious difference between the German and Marxist socialisms is the extreme nationalism of the German socialists, along with principled opposition to any notion of Marxist internationalism, which they saw as just subordination to Moscow. Chief among the listed reasons by both Strasser and Padel is the alien nature of Marxism. Strasser writes about it, that Marxism is a socialism both liberal and alien, a doctrine whose liberal factors necessarily are unfit for the upbuilding of the socialist future, and one whose program cannot but involve in it the decline, which is part of liberalism. So Strasser said that Marxism was created as a response to the brutalization and exploitation of workers during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and because of the ego ideal of liberalism, which was ascendant at the time, Marxist socialists took on the, quote, alienism of liberalism, making it unsuitable for a German temperament.
It sounds very, incoherent.
So
it's
Strasser...
It's almost right, it's not quite.
Right. Strasser did respect and admire the SPD for its... organization of workers and fighting for workers' rights. He said they had done much good on behalf of working people and thought that it was important that Marxists be brought around to the centrality of nation. Strasser also repudiates the idea of class struggle, which is obviously incredibly important to Marxism. And
that's one of the main things.
Yes, and the role of the proletariat as the ascending class. His aim was the abolition of proletariat as a class. He wanted massive deurbanization and deproletarianization of workers. He wanted to give them a stake in the ownership of workshops and pieces of land, thus harmonizing relationships between the former ruling class, which he saw as prime candidates to be a managerial, like a professional managerial class or a managerial aristocracy, and the new estate of artisan workers.
Yeah, like most that's pretty right on, that last part. Have a managerial aristocracy.
Yeah, that's where you lose me.
Yeah.
So Padel and the GSRN also emphasized their difference with the Marxists in the National Bolshevist Manifesto. But unlike Strasser and the Black Front, Padel upholds the concept of class struggle as integral to their ideology. He says, revolutionary nationalism affirms the class struggle as an organic upheaval in the leadership of the body of the folk, by which replacing the obsolete ruling class reorients the youthful new state to a leadership based on the political and social functions of the whole. Another key disagreement that Strasser and Padel share is the rejection of materialism and atheism. Both German socialists believe that a spiritual religious renewal would accompany the human flourishing that the establishment of socialism would bring about. Pedal writes, revolutionary nationalism understands the potency of the idea, the need for religious renewal, and the existence of irrational force. It sees in the idea that the nation is the ultimate goal, and in Volkdom, a fatefully imminent power. All political and economic imperatives are the means of giving this idea form and reality.
Revolutionary nationalism understands the potency of the idea, and that's capitalized. I wonder, is Pedal was he a very? I guess it's just an indication of the influence of the German idealist philosophy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of other differences, but I think those ones do a pretty good job of illustrating the incompatibility of German socialist and Marxian thought, right?
Yeah, those are big differences.
So, in the words of Otto Strasser, the function of a nation's economic system is to satisfy all the citizens' needs for food, clothing, and shelter, and to put up the reserves for troubled times. So, key to Strasser's ideas about the socialist national economy is the concept of autarky. So for Strasser, food independence was absolutely necessary. It's something he shared with Hitler. It's the idea that Germany needed to be able to produce as much of its own food and essential goods as possible, so they wouldn't ever have to deal with what happened to Germany at the end of World War I, where they almost starved to death because of blockade.
Right, or what we have to deal with right now when it comes to picking fruit in Argentina, shipping it to Thailand to pack it into cans, and then shipping it to the West Coast to distribute it in supermarkets.
Right. So Strasser thought that Germany should not have to trade at all in order to feed its people, and that technology should be used to find synthetic versions of oil, cotton, and rubber. He said, efforts to make our national economy independent of the rest of the world will be facilitated by simplifying the lives of our fellow countrymen. Under the capitalist system, a great many, quote, daily needs are artificially developed by advertisement. Simplifying life would not mean a relapse into barbarism, for culture is not dependent on luxury or upon the gratification of needlessly created wants.
That's kind of hard to disagree with that.
Yeah. Strasser
there are other
sees
things about Strasser that are disagreeable, but that's not one of them.
Right. Strasser sees German autarky as a transitional phase, only meant to last until the political conditions of his day gave way to something more amenable to his ultimate goal, which would have been a federated European Union.
Huh.
So he said that this union would be a way to abrogate the tendency for Europe to plunge into civil war. His vision of federalization is one of a peaceful unification, and he looks with disdain on Prussian and, quote, Hitlerite imperialism. Now,
you know what? I also look with disdain on Prussian and Hitlerite imperialism.
Yeah, same. Similarly, Pedal calls for a German-Russian autarky as a transitional goal, with German autarky being the ultimate goal. So, Pedal envisioned a union of a strong German national state allied to the Soviet Union as its sole trading partner. So it's important to note that Pedal completely rejects the idea of unifying or federating with the USSR. He rejects Marxist internationalism and the KPD's subordination to Moscow. He writes, we commit ourselves to the nation. It is our last political value as fateful expressions of folkish community. We commit ourselves to the folk as the national, ethnic, cultural community.
It would not have advocated signing on to the Warsaw Pact.
Maybe signing on to the Warsaw Pact with the stipulation that, Germany calls its own shots. The Soviet Union couldn't tell them what to do, right?
So signing on to the Warsaw Pact the way everybody thought they were doing.
Right. So, because of this orientation, they marked themselves off as completely different from Strasser and the Black Front, who refer to Bolshevism as the deadly peril to Europe, a peril which within Europe must be overcome, and on the eastern edges of Europe must be made to keep its distance. So that's a lot different than Pedal's vision.
Pretty much the opposite.
Pedal's eastward orientation isn't unique. There were a lot of German conservative revolutionaries that saw an alliance with Soviet Union as a way to build up a bulwark against Western liberalism. And in fact, I think that in the early days of the NSDAP, the Strasser brothers and Goebbels thought that there was potential for an alliance with the USSR, but they quickly jettisoned that as the official position of the NSDAP became more and more and more anti-Marxist and anti-Bolshevik.
Yeah, it's funny because it seems to be a very rational development at first, like with the Soviet more or less abandonment of world revolution for like kind of a while.
You know, they saw the rise of Joseph Stalin as being a positive development because it meant that socialism in one country was developing, and they were like, okay, yeah, that's what we're into. We're into socialism in one country as well. And within the NSDAP, there was Hitler's deputy Führer ends up being like one of the key members of the Nazi Party is Rudolf Hess, who was a student of a guy named Karl Haushofer in Munich. And Karl Haushofer basically gives Hitler the idea of conquering Lebensraum in the East. He has he's a geopolitical theorist, and one of his theories is that Germany can't survive without conquering basically Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia in order to feed its population. So that's whenever that idea is adopted by the party, then the idea that allying with Russia is a possibility goes out the door. Allying with the Soviet Union goes out the door.
Because those are mutually antagonistic positions.
So both strands of German socialism advocate a strong, independent national state and a political and autarkic alliance with its neighbors. But Strasser's felt a pull to the West and the values of Europa, while Pedal saw Soviet communism as amenable to his goals. Okay, let's talk private property.
Yeah, let's do that.
So both currents of German socialism are in rough agreement. Strasser proposes a complete abolition of private property and, in a barb aimed at the Nazis, says there's no version of German socialism that can exist while land, minerals, and the means of production are in private hands. He says that the same goal exists in Marxist ideology, and to this extent, that makes them socialists, as opposed to the NSDAP, who are not remotely so.
Yeah.
However, rather than from any Marxist source, both the Black Front and the GSRN adopt a view that is more in line with folkish nationalist views, drawing its inspiration from medieval property law. So, according to Strasser, German socialist idea of property is, quote, based on our conservative views of the nature of German human beings. Biological and historical experience precludes the possibility of any changes in human nature, and even of the intention to change it. So Strasser maintains that German socialism would be drawn from the nature of the folk and not imposed upon them. Since Germans naturally possess a spirit of independence, a delight in responsibility, and took special joy in creation, it would be necessary.
Uniquely German qualities?
Yeah. Oh, clearly. That can only be achieved by care for one's own personal possessions. So in order to satiate that need, he calls for a system of entail, which means granting possession, but not ownership, of property to a fief holder that works and lives and pays taxes from the proceeds on the fief. So in this formulation, the Germanic people, embodied by the state, take the place of the medieval monarch or lord, so that all property is ultimately collectively owned. This system of property relations is, according to Strasser, the most in line with the Germanic spirit and provides a fruitful tension between community spirit and individual will. Pedal advocates something similar, calling for a socialist planned economy that binds the folk and the nation into an organic structure by transferring the land and the means of production to the nation as common property. So that would include the nationalization of large and medium-scale industry, breaking up large land holdings, and issuing Reich entails to farm workers. So Pedal writes, revolutionary nationalism strives for the appropriately German solution to the peasant question, It is of the conviction that the integration of small peasants into the planned economy through a private property abolishing fief system must preserve the eternal category of the peasant. Does that sound very Bolshevik to you?
It doesn't sound very Bolshevik, but it sounds similar enough to the actual inaction of the communist program.
It sounds more SR to me than anything else.
Yeah, I think like in the Soviet Union, there's this kind of unspoken, maybe even unconscious, like, well, I mean, whatever. There is the collective farming does change things. So yeah, I guess the better way to put it is just that for the Narodnik tradition, and so for the SRs, this is basically the same thing.
Right. But if we're thinking Bolshevism the way that Germans in the 1920s and early 30s would be thinking of Bolshevism, does it sound very Soviet or Bolshevist to you?
No.
While forced collectivization and forced proletarianization is occurring on a massive scale in the Soviet Union.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So Soviet Marxism at the time aimed to proletarianize the peasantry through collectivization, urbanization, and industrialization. In both the Strasserist and the National Bolshevik currents, we see that the romantic anti-capitalism is strong, and they draw their inspiration from pre-modern social and economic organization. Otto Strasser's vision of German industry is completely different from Karl Otto Padel's. Karl Otto Padel wanted to, just run the big factories with factory councils, and Strasser wanted to. Let me quote Strasser here. German socialism emphatically repudiates a totalitarian claim on the part of any one of these three factors, whereas capitalism makes a totalitarian claim on behalf of the entrepreneur, fascism makes a totalitarian claim on behalf of the state, and communism makes a totalitarian claim on behalf of the workers. So Strasser calls this vision of cooperation a factory fellowship, which is kept in place through the establishment of vocational councils that would organize smaller workshops rather than large factories.
I mean, sure, I guess that's a decent idea, at least as a transitional demand or whatever, but it's not anything that actually seems like would actually happen.
Right. So...
Because I guess Strasser, because he rejects the tendencies that capitalism produces. And
right.
It's just like, this is just bad ideas that people have rather than compulsions that they feel regardless of their ideas. Right.
I mean, so that's why, so Strasser basically wants to reduce the needs and wants of the people and then de-industrialize the economy.
Right.
So how do you defend yourself in a de-industrialized economy, right? How do you produce the planes, tanks, bombs, guns? You don't, right? You just have like little militias, and you live in a federated Europe where everyone cooperates. So
yeah, like if everybody just did the right thing instead of the wrong thing, everything would be okay.
The good ideas force needs to get in people so that they have the right ideas.
Right, and that's of course separate from anti-Semitism.
Right.
Which is still just bad ideas.
Right. Well, I mean, and Strasser's anti-Semitism is different than Hitler's. Like, his is very cultural. Like, Strasser didn't advocate for kicking all the Jews out of Germany. Like, he wanted them to just be more German.
Right, and I think that's important. You know, that's important to recognize.
It's still anti-Semitism, and you just see Hitler is the slippery slope conclusion of that kind of German anti-Semitism, that alienation of one group from everyone else because they're different.
It's that German anti-Semitism and that Anglo-American biological racism. Put them together and you get Hitler.
Yep. So he says that there are three distinct elements of his new industrial arrangement, which are as follows. An estate of managers that replaces the capitalist class, constituting a new aristocracy of commissioned officers of economic life. You have to remember the military influence on all of this is very strong. Commissioned officers of economic life. The class of proletarians would vanish, replaced by an estate of fully privileged workers with a stake in the success of their workshops. The state would cease to be a police force of the capitalist market, instead becoming the trustee of the consumers, apportioning products of labor where they are needed. As for non-industrial workers, Strasser envisions all handicrafts, retail shops, and white-collar professions to be incorporated into guilds or corporations, which have authority granted by the state to levy taxes, determine rules and guidelines, grant diplomas and certifications, and to coordinate fulfillment of needs. Peasants and workers
nice.
Oh, isn't it? Yeah. Peasants and workers' cooperatives or trade unions would promote vocational training and advocate for economic and political interests of its members. So you see, this essentially is a vision of conservative corporatism that envisions cooperation between all the classes working in harmony for the good of the nation, which is very common among folkish nationalists and fascist movements in other countries like in Italy or Romania or even Spain. Patel's vision is different. His vision is for industrial workers to organize and nationalize all large and medium scale industry. And he doesn't care about deurbanization or deproletarianization. His vision for organizing society is based on coordination through a system of workers' councils where political and economic decisions are made by workers and peasants' deputies.
Yeah, again, like the Bolshevism in National Bolshevism is more than just an aesthetic distinction. It's like, we're not German socialists. We are Germans and socialists, but it's different.
Right. So Strasser eschews traditional German conservative ideas of hereditary monarchy for the sole reason that quality is not guaranteed to be passed through the blood. Instead, he proposes the creation of a Reichspräsident, which would be elected for life, and he would act as the executive office of governance. Secondly, there would be a Great Council, which consists of the presidents of the provinces of the Reich, 5 ministers of state, and the Presidium of Reich Chambers of Estates, which would be a body that would be responsible for electing the Reichspräsident. A third branch of government would be the Reich Chamber of Estates, which would consist of representatives from the estate system. So the estate system is would have representatives from all the different classes, classes of society.
It's kind of like a Senate, but for all the corporations.
Yeah. So Strasser believed that the estate system repudiates the, quote, pseudo-democratic principles of equality and instead acknowledges that some are, quote, unequal in bodily, mental, and religious respects, making them unequal in what they can do for the community. See, unequal in religious respects, you know who he's talking about there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's talking about the Jews. Instead, the system would abolish parliamentarism and bourgeois democracy, replacing it with an authoritarian, semi-democratic corporatist system that draws representation to the reorganization of classes into estates of productive citizens. So voting eligibility is determined by meeting a quote, prescribed minimum by way of achievement on behalf of the community, like being gainfully employed, essentially.
Yeah.
And then I go into a little bit of detail about the way that the corporatist system would be organized, with chambers representing workers, peasants, liberal professionals, meaning, the clerical professions. When I say clerical, I mean like not white collar professions. There we go.
Right. Not like clerical, like
priests.
Right. Yeah.
Industry and trade. All those vocational councils supervise wages, working conditions, training, and blah, blah, blah. So, and they would administer all of the distribution of fiefs and entails. I think we can move on from that and get to the section of the National Bolshevist Manifesto, which is titled Council State or Corporate State. So Patel's vision is basically a return to what he calls old Germanic democracy, which the council state idea comes from. He said it is not an invention of the Bolsheviks, and it is in no way a racially foreign import from Russia. Rather, it is a pre-modern organization to which Germanic temperament is most suited. And he cites the Germanic tribal council known as the Ting, spelled thing, as an example.
It's just funny because it's all kind of true, but it's also kind of not. It's like there's something in your prehistory which it can be called back on, and Marxists would say the same thing. Actually,
yeah,
they wouldn't say, "Oh, the Russians figured it out. We should do that." what the Russians figured out is that there's something in what we call primitive communism. There's some basic cooperative nature of humanity. And so in Russia, it's the Soviet form and whatever. And in Germany, it's something else. But it's still the Soviet.
Right.
It's just a different word.
I mean, he's also trying to make a Bolshevism or socialism that would be, appealing to German nationalists.
Yeah, right.
So he emphasizes the Germanic nature of his Soviet system. So at the top of the National Bolshevist state would be the Greater German Council Congress, which consisted of representatives from regional councils, which consisted of representatives from local councils, and all working people would be eligible to vote in council election organized through districts for proletarians, peasants, and residential districts for artisans and the middle classes. Interesting here, there's still a place for the middle class in the German Socialist Society.
Yeah, I mean, it's in this case, in this respect, it's more rational, a little bit more honest.
So each one of those districts elects members to councils, which would establish a special committee rather than corporations or guilds on occupational basis for deciding vocational matters. And a Great German Council Congress would sit on top of the government structure, deciding legislative matters and commissioning government agencies. Like Strasser, he advocates for a dissolution of political parties, centering all representation on the council government, whereas Strasser would have centered all representation on the corporative government. Pedal decries the corporative state, as advocated by fascist organizations and Strasser's Black Front, as foreign and Catholic.
I don't really see as much of a divergence between their conceptions as he does. I mean, there's some,
Pedal's,
but they're not quite as much.
I don't know. Pedal's conception is radically democratic.
Yeah, I just mean like the corporate state democratic aspirations are not quite as mutually exclusive as I think he. Well, again, I don't know. Maybe there's more that I haven't read.
I mean, he's essentially advocating for like the 1917 style Soviet structure of government, which is not corporatist at all. In fact, the workers' councils would be the ones that decide on all matters. And there would be no corporations because the classes are done away with. There's no bourgeoisie that needs to have its interests reconciled, right?
Yeah, I guess that's a pretty big distinction.
And in Strasser's conception of it, the bourgeoisie is the managerial aristocracy, right?
Yeah. Which is
it's hard to conceive of how that could be considered socialist, right? There should be no managerial aristocracy in socialism.
As a socialist, I think I would have to say I agree.
Yeah. Pedal says of the idea of corporatism, shared public responsibility will be smothered in a tangled mass of corporate organization. The state here is, in essence, only a manufacturing company.
Pedal seems he's a lot more sympathetic than Strasser.
Yeah. They both still shared ideas of a Germanic ethno-state, though.
Yeah.
So, basically, the National Bolsheviks don't necessarily really deal with the Jewish question. It's alluded to in different portions of their writings. Like was mentioned before, they're like ideas about, usury and the foreign import of capitalism as represented in like sort of Jewish-controlled banks and stuff like that. But they don't really have a very strong position on the Jewish question. The Strasserites have a pretty tolerant...
pretty strong one, right?
It's pretty tolerant by comparison to Hitler, though. To Strasser, national minorities can exist within the Germanic state in enclaves. And anyone can become German by simply adopting Germanic custom and language. So it's basically the way that most bourgeois nations feel about national minorities in their own countries. It's the way that Americans feel about, national minorities here.
Yeah.
So it's not radically fascistic in a way that would be understood as represented in like the more racialist, fascist organized communities like the Nazis or whatever. countries, not communities. Yeah, he doesn't share any of the biological racism of Hitler, but rather sort of a German cultural chauvinism that is pretty similar to most bourgeois nations' cultural chauvinism.
At least at the time.
At the time, yeah. And this is back when ethno-states were the order of the day, right?
Yeah, like every state was an ethno-state.
For sure.
With different amounts of tolerance for national minorities, but very clearly a dominant ethnic group in every state.
Specifically in the interwar period, though, like after the breakup of the major empires, like the Russian Empire, the German Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Ottomans as well. The concept that was used to organize these collapsing empires was national ethnostates, right? So you get Czechoslovakia, which is actually a pan-Slavic state. Yugoslavia is actually a pan-Slavic state. But like Poland, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Greece, all of these countries are ethnostates with national minorities.
Turkey is an ethnostate which will not tolerate a Kurdish ethnostate or national cultural autonomy of the Kurdish people either, of the mountain
or the
Turks.
Greeks.
Or
there was like a massive ethnic cleansing of Greeks.
Yeah.
Which was sort of provoked, still wasn't justifiable, but the Greeks sort of tried to ethnically cleanse Turks from Western Anatolia, when they invaded in the early 1920s. But so just massive amounts of racial violence in the interwar period. Even in Czechoslovakia, there was racial violence against the Germanic minority. It wasn't like at the level that Hitler made it out to be in order to justify taking the Sudetenland, but
in order to justify a racial violence of the kind that he pretended the other side was doing.
Right, exactly. So, the same thing with that was his justification for invading Poland as well, right?
That's also what the Turks said about the Armenian genocide. Well, they were trying to genocide us, Well,
that's what Israel says about Palestine.
Yeah. That's what ethno-nationalists say about other ethnicities.
Yep. So, basically looking at Strasserism and National Bolshevism, you see that there are some major components of fascism that aren't present.
Yeah.
So, like, the Strasserists are anti-militarist, for one, which is to a pretty extreme degree.
They have a Führer principle, though.
No, the Strasserists don't have a Führer principle. They're against cults of personality. So are the National Bolsheviks, yeah. So you're missing the militarism, you're missing the Führer principle, but you still got.
I guess they have the president for life is a different.
Right,
it's similar, but it's not the same thing. Right.
No, he's elected and interchangeable. It's still it is a sort of authoritarian democracy, but it's very specifically eschews the Führer principle. And what else? It's like there is a little bit of militarism implied in National Bolshevism, because they think that the Germanic state should unite all German speakers. So ideally that would be done peacefully. And so the Strasserists think that too, but to the Strasserists, it has to be done peacefully. And because they're going to deindustrialize the country and, get rid of their war-making power.
Because they don't want to go to another world war, which is better than what happened instead. Yeah.
Yeah. There's there are, in our time, Strasserists are a lot different than these Strasserists that we're talking about. Most Strasserists are just basically Nazis that believe in emphasizing the socialist portion. So they're just as racist and ethno-nationalist as the worst kinds of Hitlerites, but also emphasize the socialist portion of National Socialism.
Right.
So in the one figure that we could point to for probably bridging that gap between Hitlerite National Socialism and Strasserism and carrying those ideas into the modern day would be Francis Parker Yockey, who we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Whose attempts to create a fascist international saw him going all over the world trying to unify different versions of fascism into a nationalist international.
Yeah.
And then there have been rebirths of Strasserism since then, and of National Bolshevism since then.
Yeah, I mean, Pedal comes out ahead in this. He seems better. He looks better, whatever. Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder. I mean, whatever. What might have been if not for the war? But there's all kinds of other things instead. Like, it's the same way that when we talk about the German Communist Party. Like, what if they were a little bit different, a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, like, there are some fundamental flaws in the National Bolsheviks, though. Like, their sort of mystical folkish nationalism is, it's a non-starter.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't doubt that without the drive to exterminate Judaism, they would have been better. But still, there's this, nationalist expansionism as part of it still, So there definitely would have been some kind of war. It might not have been a racial war of annihilation against Jews and Slavs, but there would have been war, probably. I don't know. It's hard to say. But racial nationalist expansionism is, not that cool.
Yeah, I would say that's a bad idea. Maybe one of the worst ideas that people have ever had so far.
Yep. People have had some bad ideas.
So you write, contrary to the contemporary interchangeability of the terms Strasserism and National Bolshevism, the two ideologies had conflicting visions of the future that put them at odds with one another. A comparison of the literature of the two groups illustrates that the key differences between the groups lay in a vision of a corporatist class harmonization versus a councilist class warfare. And yeah, that's huge. In most other respects, they are directly connected to the Volkish nationalist lineage.
That about sums it up right there. And whether or not any of this information is useful to people is sort of, immaterial.
I mean, it's important in as much as this contemporary interchangeability of the terms is insisted upon.
Yeah.
To the extent that
it's just incorrect.
To the extent that the terms are used, they should be understood. And that's really the point.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.